I now call the September 20th, 2022 special meeting of the City Council to order. Ms. Hoffman, if you can take roll, please.
Ms. Elmore? Present. Mr. Cahill?
Present.
Ms. Kyle?
Here.
Mr. Skidmore? Mr. Hermes?
Present.
Mr. Doan?
Present.
Mr. Meyer?
Present.
Ms. Skidmore? Ms. Nicely?
Present.
Mr. Nipper?
Here.
Ms. Reckers?
Here.
Ms. Jasper Lucas?
Here.
Thank you so much. Mr. Gatlin.
We have a resolution of the City Council of the City of Erlanger, Kentucky, overriding Mayor Fetty's veto submitted to Erlanger City Council on September 12, 2022 of the budget amendment approved September 6, 2022. This will take a supermajority of 8 of the entire body to veto this.
Okay, do I entertain a motion that we adopt this resolution as read? Ms. Jasper Lucas and Mr. Meyer. Any discussion?
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Doan?
I want to understand I don't think there was ever any discussion on council about the budget amendment, the purpose for it, and why we're transferring $5 million from the general fund reserves into the capital. I know that we've had conversations among council outside of, but I would like to hear some of the reasoning behind it.
Is that directed to a particular person or
Well, I
just
think
anybody?
I think it's Gary. So I mean, if Gary wants to, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to, have some additional discussion about it. I know before we actually had our first reading, I can't recall if you were here, Mr. Dunn, but we did, talk about it before we brought it forward to the first reading. And essentially, what I was, looking at here doing, and I think sometimes I don't necessarily state my case as well as I should, but when I think about this one, I almost reflect back to over a decade ago where, this council, or some members on this council and other councils made a hard decision to say, hey, we want to take some money, carve out and create a capital fund, and redirect some of the payroll tax there. And that wasn't an easy thing to do, but it ensured that we had, some stability in our road development that had been lacking for, quite a number of years, where we had some significant issues with our roads. And even to this day, I think, what are we, probably 14 years into that program, and we still have roads that are crumbling. So I was kind of looking at this as really that phase 2, right? Yes, we've got money that we put in there for the capital fund. We spend roughly $2.5 million a year just in the roads. Now, if you look at, the budget line items, we don't necessarily put $2.5 million every year into our capital fund from the payroll tax that was there. So this was really looking at how do we stabilize the other things that we spend at a capital fund. We've got our police equipment, our fire equipment, our public works equipment, all of this other stuff that we do, buildings. And this was just taking a small portion of, I believe we've got $15 million in reserves right now. So not a small portion, but a third of what's there, and saying, hey, we're going to create a reserve in our capital as well to be able to endure the, the unforeseen. I think we talk about, we can read in the news that, inflation rate is at, 9%, 8 to 9%. In reality, the things that are hitting our residents are in excess of 9%. I think groceries are up 20%. Fuel is up more. So as they start to, spend more money on those things, I looked at this as saying, okay, we're going to set some money aside so that when we get to a point where, or should there get to a point where there's, not as much funds coming in from our payroll tax because, maybe payrolls have gotten cut, that we've got money sitting there so that we don't have to make a decision or raise taxes to pay for the roads, to buy a cop car, to buy a fire truck, and the things that our residents really require of us, the things that they depend on us. So that's kind of where my thinking was. make sure that we're investing in the future. Just a small amount, I think we could say, okay, let's take everything that's there, that's not restricted, and move it into the capital fund. But I was just trying to take a smaller approach. Let's get some money there, and make sure that as we have these unexpected things that could come up over the next several years, that we have at least, thought through what could happen.
I kind of see this as a breach of our fiduciary duty to the citizens. We're taking 1/3 of our capital reserve, of our reserves, to put it into a restricted fund that can only be spent for a certain amount of items, and items that we haven't budgeted for, items that we haven't line itemed, items that we haven't decided how to spend, simply for the purpose of just putting it over there. This is an accounting transaction. This isn't truly a budget amendment. We just saw what happened in Eastern Kentucky. We just saw communities being decimated, and they didn't have money, they didn't have funds, they didn't have sufficient general reserve funds to come in and to bail out their citizens and to bail out their communities. If something like that were to happen here in Erlanger, great, we can buy new police cruisers, but we can't help the citizens in an effective time frame. We would have to go back, we would have to go through 2 meetings to reallocate that $5 million. So it sounds nice that we're going to look at, inflation, and we're going to talk about these certain issues that may affect us in the future. But ultimately, we're derelicting our duties here as city council members by continuing to allow this to go forward. And I'm a strong no vote against it.
Yeah, I want to correct one thing, though, in what you said, to have to go through 2 meetings. I think if you, took a second look at, the Kentucky Revised Statutes, specifically around us passing an ordinance, in an emergency situation, we do not need to have 2 readings of an ordinance to pass it through. We can actually do that in 1 meeting. So if we had that situation, an Eastern Kentucky type situation, we could pass that in a single meeting if an emergency is declared. So we do have the ability to get through that if we absolutely needed to. I think further, though, when we say, breaching our fiduciary duty, this council has already passed a restricted funds, right? So we're restricting and can't let our reserve funds go below, was it 3 months, I believe, of our anticipated expenses over the course of an entire fiscal year. So I don't say that this is necessarily a breach of our fiduciary duty, but a commitment to our fiduciary duty to ensure that, yes, of all the things that could happen, we've taken account for, the fluctuation in funds and having an emergency reserve there that we can't touch, and that's $6 million-ish. And this is just saying, yeah, we're making a commitment to all of the other things for which we have a responsibility, so that if, something happens over the course of 3 years, we're not, back in the hole again, trying to make sure that we can continue to operate in a normal fashion across all facets, operations and our capital expenditures.
I would also say, I think dereliction of duty is not a fair statement to say at all. In May, Mrs. Kramer presented council and department heads with the financial forecast projection memo, and that was in conjunction with the budget. And the memo gave a high-level overview of forthcoming expenditures, anticipated contractual services, materials, utilities, building maintenance, and one-time expenses for public works. That forecast utilized unreserved funds to balance and help balance the budget. The projections assumed the city would begin to draw down the unreserved fund balance while retaining the target fund balance of 30% expenditures that Mr. Meyer was just speaking of. So this memo and the projections really didn't sit well with a lot of council members. And after we were presented with the budget, the ad hoc budget committee met, and we discussed many of the items in the budget with both Mrs. Kramer and the mayor. We discussed the necessary compensation increases for police, our fire, and other departments, and the immediate needs of our city. The ad hoc budget committee committed formally at that time that we wanted to evaluate the budget and revisit forecasting after the budget was passed, which is exactly what we're doing. We wanted to prioritize in that moment passing a good budget and revisit spending at a later date. Well, it's now September, and many of my peers and I don't have an appetite to utilize the unreserved fund balance to balance the unreserved funds to balance the budget. We want there to be a focus on future planning and the resilience of our city, because we do have uncertain economic times ahead of us, and I think it would be irresponsible if we were to consider drawing down those funds and using them simply to balance the budget. So because we're living in unprecedented times, we've seen fuel surges. As Mr. Meyer had mentioned, we're seeing inflation at the grocery store. Our residents are hurting, and we know that there is taxation changes and even more volatility coming to our business community in 2023. So all we're looking to do, and I'm saying we because I do support this resolution to overturn the budget, the veto, is to secure these funds for future capital projects and police cruisers and ambulances and other capital expenses that Erlanger needs, so that we have a clear path for affordability for that necessary equipment. So I do think that a yes vote is a promise to use these funds for the right things in the future. Thank you.
Would you agree that a no vote is also a promise to use those funds in the future for those same issues? I mean, it could be done easily, right? We would just have to line item and allocate that as council.
Yes, but this is also, as Mr. Meyer said, taking 1/3 of the money and not using it for based on the projections that we received earlier in the year, because there was opposition to that. A lot of us don't have an appetite for winding down those funds, and many people on this governing body were there during the last economic downturn. You guys had to make some very tough decisions, some decisions that me being on council for the last 4 years haven't had to make. We had a tough budget during the pandemic, we for sure did. But nothing like some of you guys have seen. So I think that this is more taking that into consideration. There's not even really an appetite for additional public debt. And we certainly don't have an appetite to raise taxes. So it's more taking a step right now to ensure that those funds are there for those capital purchases in the future.
Ms. Jasper Lucas, it's all you. You're good.
I just couldn't hear you, just making sure. I am going to support the override of the veto, and I actually think it's my fiduciary duty to do that. This amendment already passed with only 3 no votes. It restricts $5 million, in unrestricted reserve funds to only the following items. And I just want to read that list again because Mr. Nipper wasn't sure, I'm sorry, not Mr. Nipper, Mr. Doan wasn't sure that we had discussed it previously, and it was discussed at length. I'm also sharing this list for the public. The list of items that this money could only be spent on is vehicles, public works equipment, public facilities, land acquisition, police department capitalizable equipment, including but not limited to radios, radar units, and firearms, fire and EMS department capitalizable equipment, grant projects, municipal aid road fund projects, new sidewalk project, sidewalk maintenance, and asphalt and contract roads. Since Mr. Doan brought up Eastern Kentucky, I'll just mention that those items would be pretty important to have or to be able to fund quickly in an emergency situation like Eastern Kentucky. If we're going to spend our savings, I believe it should be restricted to these essential items. I'm already uncomfortable with the amount of what I call fluff in our budget. It's my job or my fiduciary duty to make sure that taxpayers' money is focused on public safety and infrastructure, such as roads and sidewalks. If we want to continue to lower taxes, we need to reduce spending, especially on fluff. Here's some items of what I would call fluff from the most recent budget, and I just went back to the most recent budget. Not saying these items are not important, but I don't want to see our savings spent on these things, or these types of things. Paying a subcontractor to post on our Facebook page, $12,000 a year. Travel and training for general government, $24,700. A printed mayor newsletter for $10,000. We already have a monthly e-newsletter. Council chamber chairs for $3,150. That was removed because council said we didn't need them. Public awareness programs not specific to fire or police, $24,000, and city beautification, $45,000. Again, not saying those are bad things, but they're not essential. My concern is that if we're allowed to spend our reserves on things like those, that's just not, it's just not fiscally responsible. We're also, as Mr. Meyer and Ms. Reckers referred to, in a time of economic uncertainty, and we need to be mindful of the fact that our revenues for upcoming years may not be what we anticipate. We've discussed that in several meetings as well. We need to be sure that our savings is spent on public safety and infrastructure. I'm not saying don't spend the unrestricted reserves, just only spend on these things. And if you don't vote to support this veto, you're basically saying spend $5 million of taxpayer money on whatever. And our taxpayers deserve better than that.
That's not what this amendment says at all. This amendment is an accounting transaction. When I spoke of dereliction of duty, this is exactly the point, this is exactly what I was speaking on. You just mentioned all of the fluff in our budget, yet it's a budget that you voted yes for. That's the dereliction. We had an opportunity in May to review these items. June and July, we passed a budget. Why can't we let that budget sit? We're not allocating additional funding. We're not line iteming any additional funding. All we're doing is an accounting transaction. This is a waste of taxpayer time. This is a waste of taxpayer resources. And this is the second time that this unnecessary motion has come before this council.
I did bring all these things up in our budget meeting. I'm not sure if you were there. I brought all of those things up and more that I was concerned about.
I call for question on the motion.
Can I finish? Can I finish what I was saying?
There's a question that's been called on the motion. There needs to be a second.
I'm going to keep, okay. Well, I mean, I'm literally still talking. I'm
have a
fine if we
motion.
follow Robert's rules and if there's a motion for Steve's question.
Okay, I have a motion and I have a second on the floor.
A council member can shut that off. That's what Mr. Doan has chosen. I haven't heard a second yet of his motion.
Ryan has seconded.
I'm sorry?
Ryan has seconded it.
All right, so now there's a vote on that motion.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Roll call vote, please.
Roll call vote, please.
And as I understand, this needs 8 votes to approve this motion, correct? It needs 2/3 of the majority for a call to question to end debate.
I believe that's accurate.
He was asking for the vote to happen. Just, no. A yes vote will end debate and force a vote right now. A no vote will allow us to continue debate on this issue.
Mr. Hermes?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill?
No, ma'am.
Ms. Skidmore? Did you say yes? I said no. Thank you. Ms. Kyle?
No, ma'am.
Ms. Jasper Lucas?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Nipper?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Doan?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Nicely?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer?
No, ma'am.
Ms. Reckers?
No, ma'am.
Ms. Elmore?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore?
No, ma'am.
Motion has failed.
Continue.
Thank you. Back to what I was saying, Mr. Doan, I'm not sure if you were in the budget task force meetings that were lengthy, but I brought up all of these items and additional items. I chose to compromise on several things for the better of the city, which is what we do. However, this item, this thing that we're voting on now, is not worth compromising on, and it's already passed. So it's not a dereliction of duty. I'm not negating, or I'm not, not doing my fiduciary duty. I'm being a good steward of the city's money, and saying it needs to be spent on these things. It's a budget. That's what we need to do.
Mr. Hermes?
Thank you, Mayor. I've got a few things I wanted to mention about this and share some of my thoughts. First, I still struggle to understand the benefit of transferring the funds from the unrestricted, unreserved fund to the capital fund. If the money were needed in the capital fund and was unavailable, the first place we would draw from would be the unrestricted, unreserved fund. Second, the amount of money is arbitrary. The benefit's unclear. The decisions being made, in my opinion, with incomplete data. It's an enormous sum of money to move without having a specific purpose. If the intent were to spend that money in 1 year on a specific project, I might be a little bit more understanding. But there is not. Money sitting in the capital fund does not inoculate it from being misused sometime in the future. So in my opinion, money drawn from the unrestricted, unreserved fund is scrutinized more closely. When we draw money from that fund, it gets paid attention to. If the money is sitting in the capital fund already, it doesn't get scrutinized when we use that. So that's $5 million we're putting in there. Third one is a tough one, I think, for me to explain, but I'm going to try anyhow. And it's the optics. When someone looks at the history of the unrestricted fund, in say 5 or 10 years, it won't come with an asterisk that says $5 million was shifted out of the account and into the capital fund. With the fluctuations of both of those accounts and the final accounting, it'll never show as an even $5 million out of one account and into the other. We'll have accruals that get put back into the unrestricted fund, so that what comes out is probably not going to be $5 million when we look at the final accounting. So if someone tries to do some forensic accounting on this, it's not going to be really clear that it's $5 million out of one and into the other, unless it's a specific line item. So someone researching that in the future is not likely to look for an ordinance that passed in September or October that moved those funds. So the history, after my time, or after Mr. Meyer's time, or even the mayor's time, will look as if Mayor Fetty drained that account, which is simply not the case. So the third thing there, the optics of that in the future, by someone who's looking at it from the outside, it's someone who's not going to come to talk to us and ask us about that. And it's not going to be clear how or why it happened in the future. And that's why I do not support this. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to, Ms. Guile?
Yes, as someone who lived through the last recession on council, you all know that I'm very conservative, and I think that scared me a lot. Didn't live through the Depression, but I knew people that lived through that, and they were scared to death to put their money in a bank. But I did see businesses crumble. I did see Toyota move out. Revenues were down. And so, you know, I take these decisions to heart. It's hard for me to come to these decisions. And I don't want anybody to take this personally, because I'm doing this for our citizens. And I think all of us are. Every one of us here, even though we disagree, we think that we're doing the best thing. And in my mind, I'm thinking of the possibilities that we could lose a lot of revenue. And I want to make sure that we have money for our police and fire in our roads. Those are absolutely necessary. You know, you can't do without them. Maybe we'll be lucky and we won't have to go through any torture again, but when Toyota moved out, that was a big thing. And we were lucky enough that a lot of people on council were very conservative and that we did have the funds to help pull us through. But I just wanted to say that I am going to vote to override the veto, but that's my reasoning. And unless I hear some earth-shattering news that, you know, oh, we need this $5 million for this specific thing, then I don't see the harm in doing it. I really don't. I think it's a wise thing to do. And like I said, if you live through something like that recession, people didn't get raises. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of businesses closed. And it's scary right now because, as you all said, you go to the grocery store, and if you're living on a fixed income like I am, it's scary. Your money's not going as far. I'm not saying I'm in dire need or anything. I'm just saying it's scary because you see it. And you think, how much more is it going to go? Gasoline has kind of gone down a little bit, but you never know. Stock market, if you're in stock market, it's down, way down. And if you got some savings in there, you can see that. It's just really a scary thing for me. And I don't see the harm in moving the $5 million unless, like I said, somebody has something to like shake me up to say, hey, you know, this is why we have to do this. So I don't see the harm in it. So just my own opinion, sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna talk for a second. Because I overrode this veto, or I vetoed this amendment, not lightly, because I truly believe it is the right thing to do. I truly do not believe that the unnecessary movement of $5 million from one fund, the general fund, the fund that most people pay attention to. If you're paying attention to the general fund. And now we're unnecessarily moving $5 million from the general into the capital for no intended purpose. We have been so intentional, and by Mr. Meyer's guidance, we have been excruciatingly intentional with our capital fund. We have line itemed every single thing within that fund and attached the dollars to exactly what we are purchasing. So why in the world would we move $5 million from the general to the capital with no intended purpose? That goes against how we have been operating the capital fund for the entire history of the capital fund, which then lends to history not playing this out very well. What I also want to talk to you guys about is we haven't even talked about the accruals that have come in, the actual numbers. I haven't heard anybody talk to us about, let's review those projections that we had talked about back in March so that we could identify where are we actually now? How do those projections look now that we have the end of the fiscal year and we have the accruals coming in? I'm not calling on anybody. I hope that I'm being listened to. I really do, because it really matters. Because I have not talked to any of you about those projections and identifying how those projections have changed with new revenues that have come in. I mean, even today, I have new actuals sitting in front of me that blow those projections out of the water. However, we haven't had a conversation about that. So we're doing a lot of fear-mongering right now, okay? And that's what we've kind of seen for how many years now? We can't ever do a tax decrease because the sky is falling and could potentially fall at any moment. But then we do the tax decrease. and we see our revenues increase. We see our economic development increase. Okay, we have seen every single year for the last 8 years, we have been intentional with decreasing the taxes on our residents, our property owners, and we've seen our payroll taxes increase year after year after year after year. Now, I understand the economy is not great right now. However, our numbers are what we need to focus on. And how am I to have this conversation if we don't have the actual data? That's not what we're utilizing. So ask for numbers. Have a deeper conversation. If you want to do 5 million, we don't even know if 5 million is the right number. So let's actually have a conversation and get some numbers up on the board and start talking about what's our strategic plan? What is our goal? What do we want to do with this money? Do we want to increase the road fund and not do 2.25 million? Do we want to bump it to 4? What do we want to do with that money and be intentional with it? Not just a random movement of $5 million, because I can't support that. And that is why I vetoed it. Yeah.
I have one real quick thing too, just to point out to the council. I know council's aware of it because it was in the budget, but also to point out to the public. We are already moving $3.9 million from the unrestricted, unreserved fund into the capital fund this year. So this additional $5 million means we're pulling $8.9 million from that unreserved over to the capital. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Miss Nicely, I'm sorry. I have trouble seeing you.
One sec. Thank you for calling up on me. I just have one quick question. I wasn't on council 3 years ago, and do we have a figure what the reserve was 3 years ago versus now? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just go ahead and summarize what Diana was asking. So she was asking what the unreserved amount was for the last couple of years, correct?
Yes, the reserved and unreserved, yes.
So I have 2016, 2017 actual, the unreserved was 9.9 million, then it went to 10.1 million, then 8.5 million, then 9.9 million. The actual from 2020, 2021 is 10.3 million. What we have, the amended for 21, 22 says 9.8. However, the actuals as of May 31st, 2022 is 12.3. And that is not taking into consideration the 30% that we allocate for emergency reserves. So in these situations, if you look right above the last blue line, that is your reserve for emergencies, and that is a calculation of 30% of the appropriations. So it's approximately $4.5 million across. So that 4.5 is the emergency reserves plus the unrestricted, unreserved pile of money. So right now, the actuals for May 31st, 2022, so far, the unrestricted, unreserved is 12.3. And then that's not even considering what's in the capital also. So the capital, the unreserved, because there's already reserves in our capital, is 2.871, which I think that's, if you go down one page. Yeah. Yep. So if you look at the May 31st, 2022, which is that yellowish highlighted one, if you go down to the bottom, the unreserved for the capital fund is already at $2.8 million. So if you were to do this transfer and we were to spend every single dollar that has been appropriated, that would leave you with over $6.8 million in the capital reserves account. But that is anticipating that we spend the entire $3.5 million on the public works facility, which we know we will not spend that. So it's probably, in the grand scheme of things, you're going to wind up with over $8, maybe $9 million sitting in the capital reserves allocated to nothing. No, that would be after the $5 million, which is not consistent with what we have done in capital for every single year. So it truly is a complete change in our accounting process that will have, a long-term impact, I believe. But Ms. Jasper Lucas.
Thank you. I don't think we came about this proposal for the budget amendment randomly at all. I think it was very strategic, very well thought out, and I actually don't really appreciate somebody saying that it was random, that we're just pulling $5 million out of our butts and saying, let's put this aside. I'm sorry, I'm speaking. Do you have something to say? You can raise your hand.
Do I have the floor?
No. You can raise your hand if you'd like to speak, just like everyone else does.
Just keep going, please. Please.
I don't appreciate someone talking while I'm speaking.
Jennifer, everybody has been talking when other people are speaking.
So it's okay?
Actually, well, would you like me to also call you out when you do it?
I don't.
Okay, so then let's move on.
It's not random. And I also don't appreciate being told that we don't look at revenues. I look at the financial report every single month in detail. I review how the revenues are doing, and I also ask other people how things are going. I might not ask the mayor, but I do ask for the data. So just because people aren't coming to you to ask doesn't mean we don't have the information. I think a lot of us also pay attention to what's going on in our own bank accounts, in our own investments, and in the economy, and we can see what's going on in the world. So if there's earth-shattering information to be shared about our city revenues, we did ask for that. During our budget task force meetings, we said, please continue to tell us things. So again, if you have earth-shattering information, please by all means share it. But let me finish, please. I feel like we have to I have had to do open records requests to get information out of the city as a sitting council member. So to say to me, we just need to ask, no, actually, it's not that easy. There's multiple things that I have myself had to do open records requests for information that should be readily available to me. So I do get the information when I need it. I believe Mr. Meyer had his hand up as well.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer?
I'll just make these, last comments. So, one of the things that I wanted to call out is we're having a very spirited debate this evening. On September the 6th, when we actually made a motion to approve this amendment, and if anybody wants to go back and look at between the 1:35, an hour and 35, and the hour 40-minute mark of that meeting, when the mayor asked if there was any discussion or debate, there was silence. Silence from everyone. We had a vote of 8-3. I believe Ms. Reckers was not present, but I understand that if she had been, that would have been a 9-3. So clearly a supermajority, vote there. I don't know how many people around, listen to Dave Ramsey, but he's one that I listen to quite a bit. I like a lot of the things that he has to say. And if you listen to him to any frequency, one of the things you'll hear him talking about is a sinking fund. Essentially what that is creating a savings fund for those things that are going to come up. If you're a homeowner, you're going to start putting money away for a roof because you know that at some point your roof's going to fail. Your refrigerator's going to fail. Your washer, your dryer, those things, they're just going to fail. Same thing for a car. His philosophy is you pay cash for stuff, right? If you're going to save for a car, you create a sinking fund to pay for a car. That's what I'm likening this transfer to, is putting that money aside into a sinking fund so that we have the ability to pay for those things. I see this more than just an accounting transaction, and the number, and actually we don't see it on the screen, but I want to speak to specifically how I got to that 5 million number. The budget document that we originally approved actually had showing unrestricted reserves at roughly $5.8 million, I think was what the number was. It's on the screen. I was looking at what is the nearest whole $1 million number there. If it would have been 6.3, I would have said 6. So it was saying, let's look at what we're holding on to in unrestricted reserves, leave the rest there, not necessarily worry about how much extra revenue we got this year, because that would just go and create a little bit small, or an amount for unrestricted reserves. So that's where I got to that number. For the argument about, this is moving money with no plan, that's not necessarily true. Our plan is to create a savings to be able to account for these things in the future. When we talk about there is no allocation, our plan is to put aside the money. So a yes vote is saying, yes, I want to put aside a little bit of money so that I can allocate for those specific things out of the capital fund should we have another Toyota-like downturn where, a good portion of the money we get from them goes into the capital fund. So this is just protecting those pieces. It wasn't a random number. Maybe 5 million isn't the right number. Maybe it should be more. I'd like to, to look at that and perhaps bring up another budget amendment to move more money. I've heard some people supporting, saying that they would support $12 million moving into the capital fund to hold off on those things. So yeah, let's talk about that as well. But this is a start. Yes, this is not the way we've managed the capital funds, since the capital fund has been in acceptance, but we've made changes to how we manage fiscal policy. Years ago, we created an unrestricted reserve fund to make sure that we had money for operations. We passed a change to and increased, not without, significant debate, the amount of payroll tax that we had so that we could do something different. This is just taking that next step and saying, let's put some money into reserves. Yes, there's a big number there right now. Whether or not we're going to spend, the $3.5 million, I don't know. I haven't seen, specific details. That hasn't come back to council yet. So I don't know the answer to those questions. But we'll certainly, once all that comes together, we'll have more information. But I don't think it's a problem to hold on to a little bit of money, allocate it to specific capital investments. It's not even taking away everything, it's just taking a portion of what's there. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Okay, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hermes,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore, Miss Elmore,
No, ma'am.
Miss Reckers,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Nicely,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Doan,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Nipper,
No, ma'am.
Miss Jasper Lucas,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Kyle,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Skidmore.
Motion carried. Do I entertain a motion that we adjourn? Mr. Hermes? Ms. Nicely? Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Okay, now call the September 20th, 2022 special meeting of the City Council to order. Ms. Hoffman, if you can please take roll.
Miss Elmore,
Present.
Mr. Cahill,
Present.
Miss Kyle,
Here.
Mr. Skidmore, Mr. Hermes,
Present.
Mr. Doan, Mr. Meyer,
Present?
Miss Skidmore, Miss Nicely,
Present.
Mr. Nipper,
Here.
Miss Reckers,
Here.
Miss Jasper Lucas.
Here.
All right, this is a resolution that's a bit of a housekeeping issue. Mr. Parsons has been here for about 45 minutes. If you want to give us about a 2-minute discussion as to this somewhat innocuous housekeeping issue.
Is that correct now? Okay, sorry. Technology eludes me sometimes, but I'm Jim Parsons with the law firm McKeedy, Muthen and Kleekamp, and I was bond counsel for the Erlanger Commerce Center transaction, where the city actually issued 3 separate industrial revenue bonds for the various 3 building projects that are over on that site, for the project developed by Hillwood Properties and Erlanger LLC. 2 of those buildings have already sold, and you approved those transfers because the building 1 and building 2 have been sold to Stockbridge out of a California entity. This is actually the third project. So all we're doing is the resolution simply would authorize the city to execute and approve the transfer of the lease, IRB lease, to the third-party purchaser, and then also execute other related documents to allow the project to be sold from the current entity, which is ECC Building 3 LLC, to a new entity being created by the purchaser in this case. So that's really all we're doing. It does not affect the pilot agreement. It doesn't affect any rights of the city. All those things will transfer to the new entity.
All right, so this is a resolution of the City Council of the City of Erlanger in Kenton County, Kentucky, authorizing the execution of an assignment of agreement of lease from ECC Building 3 LLC, a Delaware limited liability company, to 660 Erlanger Road LLC, a Delaware limited liability company, related to its $22 million maximum principal amount taxable industrial building revenue bonds, Series 2018B, also known as the Erlanger Commerce Center project, the bonds, and authorizing other documents relating to the transfer of the lease and bonds, including but not limited to the execution of amendments to certain documents, including a First Amendment to trust indenture, a First Amendment to the agreement of lease, or an amended and restated agreement of lease, an amended and restated home office payment agreement, an agreement in lieu of taxes, and directions to the trustee to transfer to bonds to 660 Erlanger Road LLC, and authorizing the execution of a leasehold mortgage with a fee joinder related to a mortgage granted by 660 Erlanger Road LLC to its lender and other documents related thereto.
Do I entertain a motion that we adopt as presented? Ms. Kyle, Mr. Hermes? Any discussion?
If I could, just one point since,
Sure.
Sorry, Mayor. The bonds we're talking about are private activity industrial revenue bonds. The city has absolutely no responsibility for their payment. I just want to make it clear that these bonds are not the debt of the city at all.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion carried.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Okay.
All right, do I entertain a motion that we adjourn? Ms. Nicely, Ms. Skidmore, any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. All right, we'll go ahead and open up the caucus meeting. The first item on the agenda is the SRO updated agreement and resolution. Chief Rader?
This was pretty simple. It just updated the new language to reflect an SRO in every school within Erlanger and Ellesmere. This was discussed with the Erlanger Ellesmere School Board with Superintendent Molly. They were obviously very supportive of that. It was perfect timing. We had an officer that was ready to retire, that was willing to go and accept that position. So everything is good to go as long as you guys give the thumbs up. Any questions?
Thank you. Okay, next on the agenda is the nuisance regulations. Mr. Hermes?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We asked to add this to the discussion this evening when we were talking about the changes to the nuisance ordinance at the last regular meeting. We took noise and sound off of that. And at the same meeting, we have some residents here tonight from Brightleaf that were talking about issues with noise. And they're trying to look for some way to be able to control that, give police some tool to be able to help them control that, I guess. And so wanted to bring it up for discussion, and ultimately would love to have the PD's input on this, of how you would like us, or how do you think we should address it. And also, I guess, I don't know if you can weigh in at all too, Jack, on how some of the other cities deal with it as well.
I'll let Chief Rader speak first.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that everybody can agree on is, the PD originally brought this up. We do want something in place that gives us a little more bite, so to speak, when we have issues, particularly in some of the neighborhoods. Parties, I mean, the graduation parties always come to mind because we get call after call after call for loud parties, loud music, etc. The only thing that I would caution is, I know the idea of a decibel meter was brought up. I don't necessarily want to, pigeonhole us into having a specific number on a chart that says, this is out of control or this is acceptable. A lot of times we see that, decibels, people think one thing is, too loud and that decibel reading for this is acceptable. I also, I don't particularly want the burden of having another piece of equipment that is going to end up on the roof of a car that gets drove over, or it's also something that we obviously didn't budget for. So I don't want to get that specific. So I don't know, if you guys have another recommendation, but I do want something in a city ordinance that gives our officers the ability to respond to, the fireworks are always tricky because can you do fireworks? Can you not do fireworks? Is it 250 feet from a structure? Is it not? So not having to, get out the tape measure and measure, is it causing an annoyance and an alarm to others? Are there people complaining? Give us something that we can go to somebody and say, hey, cut it off. Here's the ordinance. This is what it says.
I happened to have this thought this weekend because I was at my stepdaughter's football game next to some very loud fans, and my watch started telling me that I was in a dangerous noise area. And I was thinking about us talking about this. It went off multiple times, actually. So, and that's just at a football game. Now, that was just what my watch considers too high. I wasn't bothered by it. But I know there was some concern about obviously buying these decibel meters. I haven't researched it at all. I have no idea how accurate the noise meter apps are, but I know that every police officer has a smartphone, and that would eliminate the need to buy another piece of equipment for them if we were to just use something like that. My concern about not having some number is it leaves it up to whoever's there. And I know that was one of the concerns of the residents was it's very subjective. It's, I wasn't necessarily bothered by the people that were sitting next to me at my stepdaughter's game, but it might have been too loud for other people. I'm just using that as a silly example. But I'm just thinking the app might be an option. I have concerns about not placing some number on it, and I'm interested to hear what Mr. Gatlin has to say about what other cities use, because back to the fire, and I'll just make a comment about the fireworks thing. I mean, I guess I've kind of always understood that until someone complains about fireworks, it's kind of just overlooked, especially on 4th of July. I mean, I've seen people putting off fireworks in the middle of the street, which is, I think the police should come to that, but I'm also probably not going to call the police if it happens to be the 4th of July and they're setting off fireworks in the middle of the street. So, I kind of feel like that's one of those things where we just sort of overlook that. But if somebody's having a really loud party, or the example that the residents in Brightleaf gave, I feel like we need a number that we can say, you guys need to stop. It's too loud.
So I'll kind of interject. So one city that we represent, Independence, had decibel readings in their zoning code. And I think a lot of cities actually in northern Kentucky prior to Z21, and maybe Ms. Randall can comment on that, had it kind of built into their zoning codes. Most of it had to do with construction noise and was somewhat unique to construction noise. But what Independence did is they realized the police didn't really like it. It was hard to enforce. So they kind of came up with a different solution, which I don't know if there's any perfect solution, but Independence, and this was about 7 or 8 years ago, passed a specific definition of noise pollution, has a complete set of ordinances as it relates to noise pollution, has exemptions, exceptions, such as police cars, fire, different things like that. But I think that it kind of got clever in what it said. So one of the factors of noise pollution is being unreasonably loud, harsh, or excessive noise, and here's what the definition of that is. It's any noise plainly audible at a distance of 50 feet from its point of origin. So I think the idea there being is you don't need a decibel meter, you don't need a decibel gun. If you're standing 50 feet away from the house and you're hearing rock music played, it at least hits that prong of a possibility of being noise pollution. So the other things to look at is once it hits that prong of hearing it from 50 feet away, then you look at these other factors. And those other factors are the volume of the noise, the intensity of the noise, whether the nature of the noise is usual or unusual, the volume and intensity of the background noise, if any, the proximity of the noise to a residential area or place of public accommodation, such as a hotel, motel, inn, campground, and the like, the nature and zoning of the area within which the noise emanates, the density of inhabitation of the area with which the noise emanates, the time of day or night it occurs, duration of the noise, and whether the noise is recurrent, intermittent, or constant. Now, I think a lot of that probably is too subjective for this council, but I do like the definition of excessive noise being a fixed period of time, or a fixed distance, whether that's 50 feet, whether that's 20 feet, whether that's 500 feet. I think that is probably something that would be easier to enforce than having a decibel gun. Because the other issue with the decibel gun is where that gun is pointed in proximity to the sound as well. I mean, you're still looking at, you know, a distance from sound issue. So just food for thought.
Yeah. Just two quick things on that. I know, you know, when Jack reads that, it sounds like it's a lot, but our officers are also used to enforcing KRS that, you know, makes that look short. So, you know, there seems to be, you know, it sounds like there's a lot of gray area, and there probably is, but, you know, the same could be said about charges like disorderly conduct. You know, what is necessarily disorderly to, you know, a person sitting over here or a person sitting over here? The officers have to take in, you know, the entire situation and figure it out. Secondly, I did reach out to a couple people through one of the training classes that I had several years ago, and it was actually in Colorado, so relatively close. They actually had a decibel ordinance, and what they found out was when the planes flew over and the helicopters and the motorcycles, everything was in violation of the decibel level. So when they would go to enforce something, of course, the first thing that the cops are met with is, well, what about that plane that just flew over my house? What about the helicopter? What about the motorcycle? And there the cops are again, kind of caught in the middle with, well, you're going to enforce that one, but not that. So that is something I would consider.
Two things. I think noise pollution would be a great band name. I don't know. Is 50 feet, do you think that this is something that you could work with if this was drafted into the nuisance ordinance?
So 50 feet, I would say, is probably slightly longer than the average driveway in a new subdivision. I would say they're probably closer to 30, 40 feet. So I would say that's probably like maybe the center of the street in most areas.
I think does most of Erlanger have a 50-foot setback? I don't know. So you're saying that you think that that would be acceptable if you're in the middle of the street?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess first thing I would ask is if this would be its own ordinance, or if we would make it part of another ordinance.
I don't think it matters. I mean, I think we would probably just make it a part of the nuisance ordinance and add it to the nuisance ordinance.
Okay.
Because I mean, Independence did it as its own separate ordinance because they wanted a different set of penalties. You know, I think the other issue becomes whether you want code enforcement to enforce it or you want law enforcement to enforce it. So I think that would be a kind of a stylistic thing that council would have to think about.
I mean, to me, it seems like it would be something that law enforcement would be enforcing. And that's why I was thinking maybe it should be its own ordinance and not part of nuisance.
And that's why Independence did it that way. They wanted law enforcement to do it. The main impetus in Independence, believe it or not, was fireworks. This was all triggered from fireworks. And this also was triggered by the St. Cecilia Festival. That's you always, the background history of ordinances should be a part of American legal, right? Like why this ordinance came about. But those were the two things. And so, again, council wanted it in the hands of law enforcement. Also understand Independence contracted all of that with PDS. It was just easier to keep it in-house. So in their particular case, it's a fine of not less than $50, not more than $500 is what the, you know. Now, what I don't know, and you might want to talk to the folks in Independence, is whether anyone's actually cited or prosecuted one of these and what Stacy Tapke's office would think of this. That I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, and that, you led me into that was my next question was how, you know, is it a fine? Is it, you know, how, yeah, so I guess that's really probably the only way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think from a practical perspective, if somebody was cited for this, probably nothing happens to them the first few times, right? It's probably either dismissed or probated or diverted or.
Yeah, I mean, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times we have used the, other misdemeanor not covered under the special KRS. But I think this also would go back to the other nuisance ordinance that we have discussed where, a lot of the places that this would be relative to are places that we frequent probably more than once or twice a month. So this would also kind of revert back to the other ordinance that we had discussed where if we show up to your house, 3 or 4 times in 1 month, I think that would probably go more towards the code side. And then, this would pertain specifically to us because we're getting the call at midnight, on a Thursday night, so.
I just had a quick question about how this would apply to construction noise, because you brought that up, Mr. Gatlin, and I'm remembering a time when I lived on Forest, that somebody across the street was putting new concrete in their driveway, and they were literally jackhammering their driveway at like 10 p.m., and I was done. So I'm just curious, obviously, that was loud. But you got to jackhammer the driveway at some point if you're going to take up all the concrete. So how does this apply in that situation? Is that kind of an exemption because it's construction? Okay.
It is. There's a period of time of construction. The other thing that's just interesting, just to follow up with the history I said of what triggered this, is there's an exemption that says noises originating or emanating from bona fide recreational facilities, bona fide civic organizations, bona fide charitable organizations, or bona fide religious organizations, and religious organization festivals prior to 11:30 p.m. on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, prior to a national holiday. So they specifically excluded the 4th of July festival and St. Celia's festival. I just thought it was interesting. So, yes, so construction activity is been narrowed between 8 and 7, that is an exemption if it's legitimate construction activity between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m.
I think that's fair and totally acceptable. I wouldn't want somebody jackhammering their driveway at 10 p.m., but they got to do it sometime.
I just have a thought on the fireworks, and this goes back many years. I believe that if the fireworks are shot and go on a neighbor's roof or in a neighbor's pool, that should be considered a terrible nuisance because that could create a fire. I understand kids like their fireworks. I had a son that loved his fireworks, but you have to make sure that when you shoot them, you're in a place where they're not going to invade your neighbor's house. Just like when kids have those little airsoft guns or, where they shoot those little rubberized things out. They're not allowed to shoot that on their neighbor's yard, I believe, according to our codes. And then, like I said, the other thing too, this also came up. There was somebody, I believe, on a nearby street that complained because the following day, the people who shot off the fireworks did not clean up the street, and there was a terrible mess in the street. So I think those two things, if we can get them in there, under fireworks, because to me, it's a fire hazard if you're shooting them towards your neighbor's yard and they go on a roof or even in their yard. I mean, it's just not right.
So do we want to move forward with sort of a draft legislation? We might clean up and tweak just a little bit what Independence has, and we can have it at the next caucus meeting. I'll send you a draft of that. Yes, Mr. Hermes?
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to open it up to the residents from Brightleaf. I mean, are we on the right track here? Is this accomplishing what you're wanting us to try to accomplish? If you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I believe you're on the right track. I question using the distance setback off the street because in our experience, you could have been in front, not heard a thing. Stand anywhere on the surrounding block, and you heard a lot. You know, we have 9 neighbors that we've talked to that were affected that day. Some of them called the police. Some of them didn't want to be the gripey old person, so they held back. But yeah, I do believe you're on the right track. I think there needs to be exemptions, like you said, for construction. To me, measurements are important. Daytime is different than nighttime. I mean, so yeah, you're on the right track.
Okay. Ms. Reckers.
I was just going to say, according to my iPhone, the lectern is 26 feet from here, so 50 feet is still good, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, if you're picturing a driveway on, just pick a division, you know, those are relatively short. There's a lot of on-street parking. I mean, I would say 50 feet is probably to the other side of the street from a house.
Okay, thank you. All right. The last item up for discussion is the flagship park ordinance. You all have a copy of this in front of you. I'd ask that you look at section 2.0, prohibitions. Nobody shall, by act or omission, conspire, cause, permit, promote, allow, assist, encourage, or engage in the use of flagship park in the city for organized practices by any members of an athletic team or games between athletic teams. There was a recent issue that arose with a running group that was meeting at Flagship Park. They meet on a regular basis at Flagship Park. I believe this just needs to be struck from the ordinance, and I'd ask that you guys take that into consideration. I don't understand why we would be keeping individuals from coming to the park for their pleasure or whatever need they have. Ms. Jasper Lucas.
Thanks. I had also asked for this to be added to the agenda, and I do have some additional background and further information about the cross-country team that I want to share. A couple weeks ago, an Erlanger resident contacted me about Flagship Park being used by the Blessed Sacrament School cross-country team. He informed me that they had actually been using Flagship Park for practice for the last 5 years, but they were recently made aware of an ordinance prohibiting organized sports teams from using the park. He told me that the city had previously been made aware that they were using it and didn't have a problem. He was a little bit confused about why it was now being enforced, since we didn't enforce it in the past. I told him I'd look into it and get back to him. As Mayor Fetty said, there is in fact a section of our codes, a code of ordinances from 2010 that does prohibit this. I spoke with the cross-country coach, Joe Nylander, who gave me some additional information. He explained that Flagship was an ideal location for their practices. Their team consists of approximately 100 students, grades K through 8, and they need a place to practice on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. Typically, there are between 45 and 65 students at each practice. He allows any visitors of the park who show an interest to also participate in their practices. And when they have an end-of-season pizza party at the Flagship shelter, Joe always purchases enough to share with park visitors. He also always checks our website and social media to see if there's any conflicts at the park, such as events, and he adjusts practice as needed. Last year, when the DAV had their flag display, the team stayed away from that area of the park, but he also used the flag display as an opportunity to educate the students on veterans. I spoke with Peter Glenn last week about the ordinance because I wanted to know why this existed in the first place. It's his understanding that when Flagship was originally opened, there were some concerns from nearby residents about teams using the park and having issues with parking and too many people. However, Peter has been completely unaware that Blessed Sacrament's been using the park for 5 years. And that actually indicates that they're cleaning up after themselves and doing a good job of not being in the way, since he didn't even know they were there. I understand that Flagship is not a park with ball fields like some of our others, and in general probably isn't ideal for most organized sports teams, but as the coach pointed out, it is ideal for cross country because of the paths. I believe, as Mayor Fetty said, we should just repeal this section of the ordinance regarding teams. Flagship is a beautiful park, and we should welcome young people to use it to improve their physical and mental well-being. I also wanted to mention that the coach texted me today and asked if he needed to be here tonight in case anybody had any questions. I said, I really don't think anybody's going to have any questions. I'm going to explain that we've talked, our conversation, but he is more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has, and I'll be glad to share his phone number, contact information.
All right, so can we just move forward with removing that?
And just for clarification, I'm sorry.
Is there any way that we can get them to have permits like at the other parks? So that way we do know that they're there and they can have the permit with them in case anybody questions it?
When I talked to Peter last week, he suggested that as well, and I don't know if he wants to comment or not, but that we have some permitting process so that they do have something in hand that says they can be there.
Do we already have a permitting process for all our parks?
They do need to, we do permits for the baseball fields, the tennis courts, the volleyball, all the other courts and fields that we do have permits for those. It just enables us to know who's going to be there and that whenever the teams are there, they're not interrupted or asked to leave.
But I mean, I guess that's probably an internal policy, right?
Yes.
So I would just say we would utilize the same internal policy for all parks and repeal the whole Flagship Park ordinance. For the life of me, I don't know why we would have a special treatment of Flagship Park versus other parks.
I'll just, if it's okay, I'll just let him know, Sherry, to contact you about what that process is. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so do we want to just,
It's my fault. I will say that.
Wait,
okay,
your fault.
history lesson?
We did a soccer.
Please, give
we
us the
did- we
history
did some-
lesson.
We did some soccer practices up there.
Okay, okay.
The same for the keg ordinance, I'm just going to say.
When I was talking to the coach, I said, well, when this resident originally contacted me, I'm thinking, I know there were people during COVID that were up there, sports teams practicing, and no one threw them out. And Ms. Recker said that she had seen people with pop-up, like, soccer, goals and everything. And obviously the coach had seen that as well. And that he was just completely unaware that this even existed, as were most of us probably.
All right, we will have an ordinance repealing for a first reading at the next meeting.
Cool. All right, that's it. Do I have a motion that we adjourn? Mr. Eckers, Ms. Nicely? Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion carried.